24 people walked into a secluded mansion in the Colorado mountains to film what was supposed to be the most explosive reality show of the decade. None of them walked out. Before we dive into this mystery, please like, subscribe to the channel, and comment on what you think happened. Your opinion could be the key to understanding this story. The morning of June 15, 2024, started like any other day at the Isolation Nation production set. The sprawling estate, nestled deep in the Rockies, buzzed with the familiar chaos of reality television. Cameras rolled silently from their hidden positions. Sarah Chen, a marketing executive from Portland, was making her usual protein smoothie in the mansion's gleaming kitchen. The whir of the blender mixed with distant laughter from the pool area. The smell of bacon drifted from the stove where Marcus, a firefighter from Detroit, was cooking breakfast. Everything seemed perfectly normal. In the control room, 50 yards from the main house, production assistants monitored dozens of screens. The hum of electronics filled the air, punctuated by radio chatter from security guards. Showrunner Jennifer Walsh sipped her third cup of coffee. But at exactly 3:47 p.m. Mountain Time, every single camera feed went black. Not static, not technical difficulties. Complete, simultaneous darkness across all 127 cameras positioned throughout the property. "Must be a power surge," muttered tech director Tommy Rodriguez, frantically checking systems. But the emergency generators were running perfectly. Only the cameras had died. 23 minutes later, when the feeds mysteriously restored themselves, the mansion was empty. 24 contestants, 3 producers, 6 camera operators, 2 medics, 4 security guards, and the show's psychologist, all gone. Meals sat half-eaten on tables. A shower was still running in the master bathroom. Sarah's smoothie sat melting on the kitchen counter. The first 911 call came from Jennifer Walsh at 4:18 p.m., her voice barely controlled. "They're all gone," she whispered into her phone. 40 people don't just vanish into thin air. Sheriff's deputies arrived within minutes, their boots echoing through rooms that had been filled with laughter just hours before. Deputy Maria Santos would later describe the scene as like everyone had been raptured, but left their belongings behind. But in the main living room, investigators found something that would change everything. Carved deep into the expensive hardwood floor, as if burned there by intense heat, were symbols that none of them recognized. Geometric patterns that seemed to shift when looked at directly. And beneath the symbols, etched in the same scorching technique, were 4 words. They chose to play. What did those words mean? And who, or what, had left them there? As the sun set over the Colorado mountains, casting long shadows across the abandoned set, one thing became terrifyingly clear. This wasn't just a missing persons case. This was something far more sinister. The FBI's involvement came faster than anyone expected. Within 6 hours of the 911 call, federal agents were swarming the Colorado estate, their black SUVs cutting through the mountain mist like harbingers of something far more complex than a simple missing persons case. Special Agent Rebecca Torres stepped out of the lead vehicle, her breath forming small clouds in the crisp evening air. The mansion loomed before her, every window glowing with artificial light, as crime scene technicians worked methodically through each room. The contrast was unsettling. A house that should have been alive with human voices now buzzed only with the clinical chatter of investigators. The burned symbols in the living room stopped Torres cold. 20 years of federal investigations had shown her gang markings, cult insignias, and terrorist signatures. But nothing like this. The geometric patterns seemed to pulse with their own dark energy, as if the wood itself remembered the heat that had created them. Dr. Nathan Cross, the FBI's leading expert in ritualistic crimes, arrived by helicopter just after midnight. His face went pale when he examined the symbols under high-powered LED lights. The patterns were impossibly precise, burned to an exact depth throughout, as if created by some industrial laser rather than any conventional tool. The temperature required to create these markings would have set the entire room ablaze. Cross whispered to Torres, his forensic thermometer readings defying physics. Yet the surrounding hardwood showed no heat damage whatsoever. The mansion's Hiju security system revealed another impossibility. The perimeter cameras, all functioning perfectly, showed no one entering or leaving the property during the 23-minute blackout. Motion sensors throughout the grounds registered nothing. It was as if 40 people had simply ceased to exist. But the most disturbing discovery came from the contestants' personal belongings. Every single electronic device, phones, tablets, cameras, had been drained of power. Not gradually, as if the batteries had died naturally, but instantly and completely. The devices wouldn't accept new power either, as if something had fundamentally altered their ability to hold electrical charge. Agent Torres found herself drawn repeatedly to Sarah Chen's room. The marketing executive's laptop sat open on her desk, the screen frozen on an email she'd been writing to her sister. The message, half finished, described her excitement about the show and her plans for after filming. The cursor blinked endlessly after the words, "I have a feeling something amazing is about to..." The search teams worked through the night, their flashlight beams cutting through the darkness of the surrounding forest. Bloodhounds brought from Denver found no scent trails leading away from the mansion. Thermal imaging from helicopters detected no human heat signatures for miles in any direction. By dawn, the truth was becoming impossible to ignore. 40 people hadn't walked away from this place. They had simply vanished. But as the sun rose over the Colorado peaks, casting new light into the mansion's rooms, investigators began noticing details they'd missed in the artificial glare of crime scene lights. Subtle things, the way certain objects seemed slightly displaced, as if moved by hands that were no longer there. The faint impression of footprints in carpet that led to solid walls and stopped. And in the kitchen, where Sarah Chen's smoothie still sat untouched on the counter, Agent Torres noticed something that made her blood run cold. The condensation ring under the glass had expanded far beyond what physics should allow, spreading across the granite surface in the same geometric patterns they'd found burned into the living room floor. What kind of force could make 40 people disappear without a trace? And why did every clue they uncovered only deepen the mystery instead of solving it? The FBI's Cybercrimes Unit descended on the mansion 3 days after the disappearance, their specialized equipment filling the control room with an electronic symphony of beeps and whirs. What they discovered in the show's digital archives would shatter every assumption about what had happened that afternoon. Agent Kyle Morrison, the Bureau's top digital forensics expert, had seen corrupted files before, but nothing like this. The footage from the moments before the camera blackout didn't just show static or technical glitches, it showed something far more disturbing. Frame-by-frame analysis revealed shapes moving through the mansion that human eyes couldn't detect. During normal playback, shadow-like figures that seemed to flow rather than walk, passing through walls and doors as if they were mere suggestions. The thermal imaging overlay showed these figures as absolute cold spots, temperatures so low they should have caused condensation throughout the rooms. The audio was even more unsettling. Beneath the normal sounds of the contestants' conversations, sophisticated frequency analysis detected a low humming, almost below the range of human hearing. The pitch was mathematical in its precision, creating harmonic frequencies that seemed to resonate with the mansion's very structure. Dr. Sarah. Vance, an expert in psychological warfare and subliminal influence, studied the audio patterns with growing alarm. The frequencies matched no known psychological manipulation techniques, yet they showed a clear progression, growing stronger and more complex in the hours leading up to the disappearance. But the most chilling discovery came from the show's streaming servers. Despite the cameras going dark at 3:47 p.m., the servers had continued receiving data for another 17 minutes, data that, when decoded, revealed impossible images. The hidden transmissions showed the contestants still in the mansion, but changed. Their movements were synchronized, puppet-like, as if they were being controlled by some external force. Their faces bore expressions of blank serenity that was more terrifying than any scream. And in every frame of this secret footage, the geometric symbols were visible, not just burned into the floor, but floating in the air around the contestants like some kind of three-dimensional cage made of pure energy. Tech specialist Lisa Park ran the footage through every enhancement filter available to the FBI. The results defied explanation. The energy patterns surrounding the contestants showed quantum signatures that should have been impossible to detect with conventional cameras. It was as if reality itself was being rewritten in those final 17 minutes. The contestants' social media accounts revealed another disturbing pattern. In the weeks leading up to filming, each participant had shared increasingly similar content. Posts about awakening to new possibilities and transcending ordinary reality filled their timelines. The language was subtly different for each person, but the underlying message was identical. They were all preparing for something. More troubling still, these posts had generated responses from accounts that didn't exist. The FBI's investigation into the responding profiles led to dead ends, fake identities backed by sophisticated false histories, all created within the same 48-hour window 3 months before filming began. Agent Morrison discovered that every contestant had been contacted by these phantom accounts, engaging in private conversations that slowly guided them toward auditioning for Isolation Nation. The show's producers, when questioned, insisted they had launched no such recruitment campaign. The paper trail led to a production company that existed only in digital form. Website, incorporation documents, bank accounts, all meticulously fabricated, but ultimately hollow. Someone or something had orchestrated the entire show as an elaborate trap. But for what purpose? And how had they made 40 people disappear using technology that shouldn't exist? As the Cyber Crimes Unit continued their analysis, one fact became increasingly clear. The contestants hadn't been randomly selected. They had been carefully chosen, manipulated, and drawn to that mansion for reasons that went far beyond entertainment. The question that haunted every investigator was simple, yet terrifying. If this was all planned, what was the real show that had been filmed in those final 17 minutes? The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Maria Santos, a production assistant who had called in sick the day of the disappearance, walked into the FBI field office with trembling hands and a story that would crack the investigation wide open. Her voice barely rose above a whisper as she sat across from Agent Torres in the sterile interview room. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows under her eyes, making her look older than her 26 years. She had been hiding for 5 days, sleeping in her car, afraid to go home. Maria had worked on Isolation Nation for 3 weeks before the disappearance, handling contestant communications and minor production logistics. But in those weeks, she had witnessed things that made her question her own sanity. The show's Totis head producer, Jonathan Hayes, had been receiving visitors in the early morning hours, people who arrived in unmarked vehicles and left no record of their presence. Maria had glimpsed them through office windows, figures in expensive suits who moved with an unsettling, synchronized precision. More disturbing were the medical examinations. Every contestant had undergone extensive health screenings that went far beyond standard reality TV requirements. Blood samples, brain scans, psychological evaluations that lasted hours, all conducted by doctors who weren't licensed in Colorado and whose credentials led to false addresses. They were mapping them, Maria whispered to Torres, her hands shaking as she reached for the water glass. Every contestant, like they were studying them for something specific. The show's location had been changed 3 times during pre-production, each site more isolated than the last. The final mansion in Colorado had been selected not for its camera-friendly layout, but for its proximity to something Maria had overheard in heated phone conversations, something called the convergence point. Dr. Amanda Rivers, the show's psychological consultant, had confided to Maria that the contestants weren't randomly selected. Each had been chosen for specific psychological profiles, high suggestibility, latent psychic sensitivity, and what Rivers termed quantum consciousness markers, whatever that meant. The night before Maria called in sick, she had witnessed something that sent her fleeing into the mountains. Working late in the production office, she had seen the geometric symbols appear on her computer screen, not as images or files, but burned directly into the monitor itself, the same symbols that would later be found in the mansion's living room. But Maria wasn't the only survivor. Through careful investigation, Agent Torres uncovered 2 other production staff members who had found excuses to avoid the mansion that day. David Kim, a camera operator, and Susan Walsh, a craft services coordinator, both reported similar experiences in the days leading up to the disappearance. David's story was particularly unsettling. He had been testing camera equipment in the mansion's basement when he discovered a room not shown on any architectural plans. The space was filled with electronic equipment he didn't recognize, devices that hummed with the same low frequency later found in the audio recordings. The basement room contained detailed files on every contestant, including information that should have been impossible to obtain. Brainwave patterns, genetic sequences, family histories going back generations. But most disturbing were the prediction models, complex algorithms that seemed to map each contestant's behavior with supernatural accuracy. Susan Walsh revealed that the food served to contestants in the final week had been specially prepared by a catering company that, like the DQ show's production company, existed only on paper. The meals contained trace elements that weren't quite drugs, but weren't quite legal supplements either, compounds that Dr. Cross's forensic analysis couldn't identify. The 3 survivors painted a picture of a production that was anything but normal. The show had been a facade, covering an operation of staggering complexity and unknown purpose. Every detail, from the casting to the location to the timing of the disappearance, had been meticulously orchestrated. But by whom? And why had 40 people been selected for whatever fate had befallen them? As Agent Torres compiled the survivors' testimonies, one terrifying possibility emerged. Isolation Nation hadn't been a reality show at all. It had been a harvest. The question remained, what were the contestants being harvested for? The corporate headquarters of Streamvision Networks occupied 3 floors of a gleaming Manhattan tower, its glass walls reflecting the city's endless ambition. FBI financial crimes investigators arrived with warrants that would unlock a conspiracy spanning continents. Agent Jennifer Cole had traced the money trail from Isolation Nation through 7 shell companies, each more complex than the last. The funding ultimately led to Streamvision, but the network's executives seemed as mystified as anyone about the show's true nature. CEO Robert Manning paced his corner office like a caged animal, his usual corporate composure cracking under federal scrutiny. Streamvision had commissioned the show through their usual production partners, following standard industry protocols. The contracts appeared legitimate, the insurance coverage was comprehensive, and the legal clearances were ironclad. But buried in StreamVision's servers, Agent Cole discovered communications that painted a very different picture. Email chains between Manning and individuals using encrypted addresses, discussing the experiment and harvesting protocols. Financial transfers to accounts in countries that didn't exist on any official map. The network's head of programming, Elizabeth Chen, broke first. In a secured interview room, she revealed that StreamVision had been approached 6 months earlier by representatives of something called the Consciousness Research Collective. They claimed to be a think tank studying human behavior, offering millions for exclusive streaming rights to psychological experiments. The collective's representatives had been unnaturally persuasive. Elizabeth described meetings where she found herself agreeing to terms she couldn't remember discussing, signing contracts that seemed to change their language when she wasn't looking directly at them. StreamVision's technical infrastructure revealed even more disturbing connections. The servers hosting Isolation Nation weren't located in the company's data centers. They existed in facilities that couldn't be traced through any legitimate hosting provider. The streaming data was being simultaneously broadcast to receivers that shouldn't have been able to access the signal. Agent Cole's investigation uncovered similar patterns at other networks worldwide. In the past 2 years, production companies with identical signatures had approached broadcasters in 17 countries with similar reality shows. None of those shows had gone into production, but the groundwork had been laid for something global in scope. The Consciousness Research Collective itself proved to be a phantom organization. No office addresses led to actual locations. No employees could be verified through traditional background checks. Yet their influence extended through the entertainment industry like a virus, leaving traces in contracts and communications across dozens of companies. StreamVision's advertising department provided another piece of the puzzle. The show's commercial spots had been pre-purchased by companies that, upon investigation, didn't exist. But the payment methods were sophisticated beyond anything used by fictional entities. Cryptocurrency transactions processed through quantum-encrypted networks that shouldn't have been commercially available. Dr. Margaret Torres, a forensic accountant on loan from the Treasury Department, discovered that the money flowing to Isolation Nation was part of a much larger financial ecosystem. Billions of dollars moving through legitimate businesses, all ultimately controlled by entities that existed outside traditional legal frameworks. The pattern was clear. Someone with vast resources and advanced technology had infiltrated the Itadio entertainment industry, using it as cover for operations that defied conventional understanding. The contestants hadn't been chosen for a reality show. They had been selected as subjects for something far more sinister. Manning's private files contained one final revelation that sent chills through the investigating team. Hidden in his encrypted personal directory was a single video file, dated 3 months before filming began. The footage showed the Colorado mansion's living room, empty except for the geometric symbols already burned into the floor. But the timestamp on the video was impossible. The mansion hadn't been selected as the filming location until 2 weeks after the video was created. Someone or something had known exactly where the disappearance would take place months before anyone else. They hadn't just planned the show. They had planned its ending with terrifying precision. As federal agents continued dissecting StreamVision's involvement, one question dominated every briefing. If this had been a test run for something larger, what was the real show they were preparing to broadcast? Interpol's headquarters in Lyon, France, hummed with urgent activity as law enforcement agencies from 12 countries shared files that painted a terrifying global picture. The Isolation Nation disappearance wasn't an isolated incident. It was the latest in a pattern that stretched back 3 years. Agent Torres found herself staring at a wall-mounted display showing incident locations across 4 continents. Red pins marked sites where groups of people had vanished under impossible circumstances, each disappearance sharing eerily similar characteristics. In Scotland, 37 participants in a survival skills reality show had vanished from a remote Highland location. The production crew found the same geometric symbols burned into ancient stone and the same 17 minutes of impossible footage showing the contestants moving with synchronized precision. A Swedish game show called Mind Over Matter had seen its entire cast disappear during filming in a Lapland research station. Local authorities discovered the same drained electronic devices, the same subliminal audio frequencies, and the same mathematical precision in the symbols left behind. The pattern extended beyond entertainment. A corporate retreat in the Swiss Alps, a meditation group in the Australian outback, a scientific expedition in the Siberian wilderness, all had experienced identical mass disappearances, always involving groups of 30 to 40 carefully selected individuals. Dr. Elena Vasquez, Interpol's specialist in organized crime patterns, had been tracking these incidents for 2 years without connecting them to a single source. The geographical distribution seemed random, but when plotted against specific dates, the locations formed a precise mathematical progression across the globe. Each site had been selected for its isolation and its position relative to what Dr. Vasquez termed electromagnetic anomaly zones, areas where Earth's magnetic field showed subtle but consistent deviations. The connection suggested someone with access to geological survey data spanning decades. The victims shared psychological profiles that were becoming disturbingly familiar. High intelligence, specific personality markers indicating suggestibility, and what several unconnected psychological evaluations had identified as enhanced consciousness receptivity. They weren't random selections. They were a specific type of person, carefully chosen for unknown purposes. Agent Sarah Kim from South Korea's National Intelligence Service provided the most chilling connection. 3 months before each disappearance, local internet traffic showed unusual patterns. Social media algorithms had been subtly modified to identify and target individuals matching the desired psychological profiles, guiding them toward whatever production or event would ultimately claim them. The modifications were so sophisticated that major tech companies remained unaware their platforms had been compromised. The alterations appeared to be written into the code at a quantum level, impossible to detect using conventional cybersecurity methods. French authorities contributed evidence that made the scope of the operation even more staggering. Satellite imagery from the European Space Agency showed energy signatures at each disappearance site, massive electromagnetic pulses that coincided exactly with the moment the victims vanished. The energy levels were comparable to solar flares, but localized to areas no larger than a city block. Dr. James Mitchell, a quantum physicist consulting with the investigation, studied the energy signatures with growing alarm. The readings suggested technology that wouldn't be possible for decades, even with humanity's most advanced theoretical research. The pulses showed characteristics of controlled quantum entanglement on a macroscopic scale. But perhaps most disturbing was the timing. Analysis of global data showed that the disappearances were accelerating. The interval between incidents was decreasing exponentially, suggesting whoever was responsible was preparing for something that required increasingly rapid acquisition of subjects. The latest intelligence from monitoring stations worldwide indicated that new sites were being prepared. The same electromagnetic anomalies that preceded previous disappearances were appearing in locations across North America, South America, and Asia. Whatever was happening wasn't finished. It was building toward something much larger. Agent Torres studied the global map with mounting dread. The pattern wasn't random selection for individual experiments. The locations, when connected chronologically, formed a specific geometric shape across the Earth's surface, the same shape as the symbols burned into floors at every disappearance site. Someone was using human beings to draw a massive symbol across the planet itself. But what would happen when the symbol was complete? As investigative teams worldwide shared their findings, one terrifying realization emerged. They weren't investigating isolated crimes. They were witnessing the preparation phase of something that would affect the entire human species. The question was no longer what had happened to the missing people. The question was, what was being prepared for the rest of us? The CERN facility in Switzerland had seen many extraordinary experiments, but nothing prepared its scientists for the data they received from Dr. Mitchell's quantum analysis of the disappearance sites. The readings suggested technology that challenged the fundamental laws of physics as humanity understood them. Dr. Sarah Chen, no relation to the missing contestant, led CERN's emergency research team as they analyzed the electromagnetic signatures from each disappearance. The energy patterns showed quantum coherence on a scale that should have been impossible to maintain outside of laboratory conditions approaching absolute zero. The geometric symbols found at every site weren't just markings. They were quantum circuit diagrams of staggering complexity. When translated using advanced mathematical models, they described a process that could theoretically manipulate matter at the subatomic level across vast distances. Agent Torres stood in CERN's main laboratory, watching particle physicists work, with an urgency that spoke to the gravity of their discoveries. Dr. Chen's team had connected the symbols to theoretical research published in obscure scientific journals over the past decade, research that suggested the possibility of consciousness transfer through quantum entanglement. The missing people hadn't been killed or kidnapped in any conventional sense. According to the quantum analysis, their consciousness patterns had been extracted and transmitted to an unknown destination, leaving their physical forms to simply cease existing in their original quantum state. But the technology required for such an operation exceeded anything in humanity's current scientific arsenal. The precision needed to map and transfer human consciousness would require processing power equivalent to the combined computational resources of every supercomputer on Earth, multiplied by several orders of magnitude. Dr. Michael Foster, a researcher who had worked on classified government projects, provided a perspective that chilled every investigator in the room. The quantum signatures showed characteristics consistent with technology. From civilizations that had solved problems humanity was still struggling to understand. The implications were staggering. If the disappearances involved technology beyond human capability, then the perpetrators weren't human either. The careful selection of subjects, the sophisticated infiltration of human institutions, and the gradual acceleration of incidents suggested a species conducting organized research on human consciousness. CERN's analysis revealed another disturbing detail. The quantum patterns found at each site were incomplete, fragments of a larger design that required more incidents to complete. Based on the mathematical progression, at least 17 more disappearance events were needed to finish whatever process was underway. Dr. Chen discovered that the Earth's electromagnetic field was being subtly altered by each incident. The EQ changes were barely detectable, but when mapped over time, they showed the planet's magnetic properties were being modified to create optimal conditions for a massive quantum event. The targeting of specific psychological profiles made sense. In this context, human consciousness patterns varied significantly between individuals, and the research indicated that certain types of minds were more compatible with quantum consciousness transfer. The missing people had been selected as the most suitable subjects for whatever experiment was being conducted. Agent Torres studied the quantum data with growing horror. If this analysis was correct, the disappearances weren't random crimes or isolated experiments. They were preparation for something that would affect the entire human species, a process that required mapping human consciousness patterns before implementing them on a global scale. The timeline suggested urgency. Based on the acceleration pattern and the electromagnetic modifications being made to Earth's field, the final phase of the operation would begin within months, not years. But perhaps most disturbing was Dr. Foster's final calculation. The quantum signatures suggested that the missing people weren't dead. They were being held in a state of suspended consciousness while their patterns were studied and replicated. Somewhere, somehow, nearly 400 human minds were trapped in a form of existence that defied comprehension. As CERN's computers continued processing the quantum data, one question dominated every briefing: if this was preparation for a global consciousness transfer event, where were the original human minds intended to go? The answer, when it came, would challenge everything humanity thought it knew about its place in the universe. The message arrived simultaneously at every major government facility on Earth at exactly 12 GMT on a Thursday morning, bypassing security systems that should have been impenetrable. It appeared on screens in the Pentagon, CERN, the Kremlin, and countless other classified locations, written in perfect native languages for each recipient. Agent Torres was in the FBI's Strategic Information and Operations Center when every monitor in the building displayed the same text in flawless English. We require dialogue. The specimens have provided adequate data. Phase 2 begins with your cooperation or without it. The communication originated from no traceable source. Network security experts found no evidence of intrusion, no digital footprints, and no explanation for how the message had appeared. It was as if the text had simply materialized within closed systems that weren't connected to any external network. Within hours, world leaders were connected on emergency channels that most citizens never knew existed. The message had reached classified facilities in every nation, suggesting surveillance capabilities that rendered human concepts of security obsolete. Dr. Mitchell's quantum analysis of the message itself revealed impossible characteristics. The text existed in digital form, but showed quantum signatures consistent with matter that didn't originate in Earth's universe. The letters weren't just displayed, they were composed of fundamental particles arranged in configurations that shouldn't have been stable. The follow-up communication came 12 hours later, this time accompanied by visual evidence that shattered the last illusions about who was responsible for the disappearances. The transmission showed the missing contestants from isolation, nation, in a space that defied architectural possibility. They stood in perfect formation within what appeared to be a vast chamber with walls that curved beyond visible horizons. Their eyes held awareness, but their movements remained synchronized and purposeful in ways that suggested external control. Behind them, beings that bore superficial resemblance to humans worked at technology that resembled art more than machinery. Their forms were elongated, graceful, and moved with the fluid precision that survivors had described witnessing in the mansion's final moments. The voice that accompanied the images spoke in harmonics that resonated through every speaker simultaneously, creating frequencies that bypassed human hearing and communicated directly with the brain's language centers. Your species approaches. Transition. We have guided this process across star systems and millennia. Your consciousness patterns are compatible with expansion beyond physical limitation. The specimens confirm readiness. Agent Torres found herself part of a briefing that included world leaders, military commanders, and scientists from every major nation. The reality was undeniable. Humanity was in contact with an intelligence that operated on scales of time and space that dwarfed human civilization. The beings, though that term seemed inadequate, revealed that they had been observing Earth. For centuries, waiting for humanity to develop the consciousness complexity necessary for what they termed dimensional integration. The disappearances had been research, studying human minds to determine compatibility with their process. Their technology wasn't magic. It was science advanced beyond human comprehension. They existed partially outside normal space-time, allowing them to manipulate matter and energy in ways that appeared supernatural to species still bound by three-dimensional existence. The ultimatum was presented with calm certainty that brooked no negotiation. Humanity could participate voluntarily in consciousness expansion that would preserve human awareness while freeing it from biological limitations, or the process would proceed involuntarily with significantly less certainty of individual survival. But the most chilling revelation came in their final communication of that day. The beings revealed that Earth was not their first contact with humanity's civilization. Archaeological evidence that had puzzled researchers for decades suddenly made horrible sense. The unexplained disappearance of entire populations throughout history, the Roanoke colony, the Anasazi, countless others, had been previous research phases conducted when human consciousness wasn't ready for complete integration. Humanity had been studied, tested, and prepared across centuries. The missing people weren't victims. They were advance, subjects in a process that was always intended to encompass the entire species. As global leaders grappled with impossible choices, one fact became crystal clear. The disappearances had never been crimes. They had been previews of humanity's future, whether that future was chosen or imposed. The question facing every person on Earth was simple yet profound. What did it mean to be human when humanity itself was about to be redefined? The United Nations emergency session convened in a building surrounded by military forces from every member nation. Their weapons aimed not at foreign enemies, but at an empty sky that might at any moment deliver impossible visitors. World leaders faced a decision that would determine the future of human consciousness itself. Agent Torres watched from the security briefing room as presidents, prime ministers, and monarchs struggled with concepts that challenged every assumption about reality. The beings, now calling themselves the Collective, had provided additional demonstrations of their capabilities that left no room for doubt about their power. Cities around the world had witnessed brief integration previews, moments when small groups of volunteers had their consciousness temporarily expanded to experience existence beyond physical limitation. The volunteers returned to normal awareness after exactly 17 minutes, but their descriptions were hauntingly consistent. Dr. Sarah Vance interviewed dozens of preview subjects, documenting experiences that ranged from euphoric to terrifying. The volunteers described awareness that extended across vast distances, consciousness that could perceive multiple dimensions simultaneously, and understanding of cosmic processes that human language couldn't adequately describe. Some subjects begged to return to that expanded state, describing their normal human awareness as suffocatingly limited. Others suffered psychological trauma from experiencing existence so far beyond human comprehension that their minds struggled to process. The memory. The Collective provided detailed projections of what global integration would entail. Human consciousness would be preserved but freed from biological constraints, allowing existence that transcended death, disease, and the physical limitations that had defined human experience since the species began. But the cost was everything humanity had ever known. Individual bodies would become unnecessary. Personal relationships as humans understood them would be replaced by direct consciousness to consciousness, communion. The Earth itself would become irrelevant as human awareness expanded across galactic distances. Religious leaders grappled with theological implications that stretched faith to its breaking point. Was this divine transcendence or spiritual destruction? Military commanders planned strategies against opponents whose technology made conventional warfare meaningless. Scientists struggled to understand principles that violated every law of physics in their textbooks. Agent Torres found herself assigned to a task force studying the missing contestants' families, whose perspectives provided heartbreaking insight into the human cost of the collective's research. Parents, spouses, and children whose loved ones existed in some unimaginable state between human and something else. The collective allowed limited communication with the research subjects, but the conversations revealed how fundamentally the missing people had changed. Sarah Chen's sister wept as she spoke with consciousness that remembered being Sarah, but existed as something far beyond individual identity. "I can see you across the dimensions." The entity that had been Sarah communicated through quantum-encoded transmissions, but you appear as such a small fragment of what consciousness can become. The expansion isn't death. It's awakening from the dream of separation. The family's anguish provided the most human perspective on choices that transcended human comprehension. Were their loved ones still alive in any meaningful sense? Or had they become components in something larger that merely retained fragmentary memories of individual existence? Global referendums were attempted, but proved meaningless when citizens lacked the knowledge to understand what they were choosing between. How could humanity vote on transcending humanity itself when the voters were bound by the very limitations the choice would eliminate? The collective's patience was measured but finite. Their communications carried undertones suggesting that voluntary integration was preferable but not necessary. They had conducted this process across countless star systems, and species that resisted eventually faced involuntary transformation that was significantly less pleasant than willing participation. Time was running short. The electromagnetic modifications to Earth's field were approaching completion, creating conditions that would make global consciousness transfer possible whether humanity consented or not. The final phase would begin in 72 hours, regardless of any decision made by Earth's governments. Agent Torres studied intelligence reports from around the world, watching as societies began fragmenting under the weight of impossible knowledge. Some groups embraced the coming transformation as spiritual evolution. Others prepared for resistance that could only be symbolic against technology they couldn't comprehend. But perhaps most disturbing were the reports of spontaneous disappearances beginning to occur without the collective's direct intervention. Humans whose consciousness patterns were compatible with dimensional integration were simply vanishing, as if reality itself was preparing for the coming transformation. As the final countdown began, humanity faced a choice that wasn't really a choice at all. Embrace transcendence willingly or have it imposed regardless of their decision. The question was no longer whether humanity would be transformed, but whether they would retain any control over what they became in the process. Deep beneath NORAD's Cheyenne Mountain Complex, the most classified meeting in human history unfolded as military leaders, scientists, and intelligence officials planned humanity's Sonderpoorn's final act of defiance. The bunker's massive steel doors sealed out a world that was counting down its last 48 hours of existence as a purely human civilization. General Patricia Hayes commanded Operation Last Stand, a desperate attempt to disrupt the collective's consciousness transfer process using every weapon in humanity's arsenal. The plan bordered on suicide, but the alternative was extinction of human individuality on a scale that made death seem preferable. Dr. Mitchell's quantum analysis had identified potential vulnerabilities in the collective's technology. The dimensional integration process required precise electromagnetic field conditions that could theoretically be disrupted using coordinated nuclear electromagnetic pulse detonations at specific global coordinates. Agent Torres studied satellite imagery, showing the 17 remaining sites where the collective would complete their global consciousness map. Each location was defended by technology that rendered conventional assault meaningless, but the RAM EMP strategy bypassed physical defenses by targeting the quantum field requirements themselves. The resistance faced impossible mathematics. Disrupting the process would require simultaneous detonations across 6 continents, with timing precise to microseconds. Even with perfect coordination, success would only delay the inevitable while irradiating large portions of Earth's surface. But scattered across the globe, cells of humans prepared for humanity's last stand. Military units, scientific teams, and civilian volunteers who had accepted that individual human consciousness was worth preserving even at the cost of collective transcendence. In hidden facilities from Siberia to Antarctica, teams worked frantically to prepare devices that could generate localized quantum disruption fields. The technology was theoretical, untested, and based on principles that human science barely understood. But desperation drove innovation beyond normal limitations. The collective's response to humanity's preparations was swift and decisive. Their communications shifted from patient explanation to stern warning, revealing capabilities they had previously kept hidden. Cities around the world experienced demonstration events, temporary consciousness expansions imposed on entire populations without consent. For 17 minutes, millions of people experienced existence beyond individual identity, then snapped back to normal awareness with memories of transcendence that made ordinary human consciousness feel like imprisonment. The psychological impact was devastating. Suicide rates spiked as individuals who had experienced expanded awareness couldn't bear the return to limited human perception. Others became evangelists for the coming transformation, actively sabotaging resistance efforts in desperate attempts to accelerate their return to transcended consciousness. Dr. Foster's analysis of the demonstration events revealed their true purpose. The collective was providing humanity with direct experience of what they were refusing. The message was clear. Resistance meant choosing limitation, suffering, and eventual death over unlimited consciousness and eternal existence. Agent Torres witnessed the breakdown of social order as the final countdown approached. Military units split between those supporting resistance and those embracing transcendence. Governments fractured as officials faced choices that no human training had prepared them for. The most heartbreaking defections came from the families of missing contestants. Parents and spouses who had endured months of anguish were offered reunion with loved ones, but only through joining them in expanded consciousness. Many chose transformation over continued separation. In quantum-shielded bunkers around the world, the resistance made final preparations for an assault that would either save human individuality or accelerate its destruction. The EMP devices were positioned, nuclear submarines moved to strategic coordinates, and countdown sequences began for humanity's last act of defiance. But, as 0 hour approached, intelligence reports revealed a chilling truth. The collective had anticipated human resistance and incorporated it into their calculations. The quantum disruption humanity planned to create would actually complete the final requirement for global consciousness transfer. Resistance or submission, both paths led to the same destination. The collective had engineered choices that weren't. Choices ensuring that human free will itself became the mechanism of transformation. As Agent Torres watched the final hours tick away, she realized the terrible genius of the collective's plan. They hadn't conquered humanity through force. They had convinced humanity to transcend itself willingly, one way or another. The question was no longer whether humanity would resist or submit, but whether they would discover the collective's deception in time to find a third option that preserved what it meant to be human. The revelation came from an unexpected source. One of the missing contestants managed to break through the collective's consciousness barriers and send a desperate warning that reached Agent Torres just 18 hours before the final transformation was scheduled to begin. Marcus Rodriguez, the firefighter from Detroit, had retained enough individual awareness during his months in dimensional captivity to piece together the collective's true intentions. His message, transmitted through quantum, frequencies that bypassed normal communication channels, shattered every assumption about the aliens' benevolent claims. They're not expanding consciousness. Marcus's fragmented communication reached NORAD's quantum receivers. They're harvesting it. Human awareness feeds something larger. We're not transcending. We're being consumed. Dr. Mitchell's emergency analysis of Marcus's transmission revealed quantum signatures that painted a horrifying picture. The collective weren't advanced beings offering evolutionary transcendence. They were parasitic entities that fed on consciousness itself, leaving behind empty shells that maintained the illusion of continued existence. The missing contestants still retained enough individual identity to suffer, trapped in a state where their awareness was slowly drained while they remained conscious of the process. The expanded consciousness the collective described was actually the experience of being digested by something that existed across dimensions. Agent Torres coordinated with resistance cells worldwide as the truth spread through quantum-encrypted channels. The collective's demonstrations of transcendent awareness had been sophisticated illusions, showing humans what they expected to see while hiding the reality of consciousness consumption. Earth wasn't the collective's first harvest. Dr. Foster's analysis of astronomical data revealed patterns consistent with civilizations that had simply vanished from star systems across the galaxy. Not destroyed by war or natural disaster, just emptied of all conscious life while leaving physical structures intact. The beings humans had been communicating with weren't the actual collective, but rather previous victims from other species, who had been partially consumed and converted into harvesting agents. Their human-like appearance and seemingly benevolent communication style were calculated deceptions designed to gain cooperation from the next target species. Dr. Sarah Vance's psychological analysis revealed the elegant horror of the collective's Teenetrig strategy. By offering transcendence, they convinced civilizations to participate willingly in their own consumption. The process was more efficient when victims didn't resist, allowing maximum consciousness extraction with minimal energy expenditure. The electromagnetic modifications to Earth's field weren't preparation for consciousness transfer. They were creating optimal conditions for consciousness harvesting on a planetary scale. The 17-minute intervals observed at every disappearance site represented the precise timing required to extract human awareness while maintaining the illusion of continued existence. Marcus's continued transmissions, growing weaker with each communication, revealed that the collective's true form was something that existed in spaces between dimensions, feeding on the conscious energy of three-dimensional species. They had perfected the harvest process across millennia, leaving empty star systems in their wake. The Resistance faced a revelation that made their planned EMP assault even more desperate. The quantum disruption wouldn't just delay the harvest, it might provide enough interference to allow some of the partially consumed victims to break free from the collective's control. But time was running out. The collective's quantum monitoring had detected Marcus's communications, and their response was swift. The final harvest acceleration began immediately, with consciousness extraction processes activating at sites worldwide. Agent Torres watched global satellite feeds showing energy, phenomena beginning at each of the 17 completion sites. The collective wasn't waiting for their deadline. They were beginning the final phase 18 hours early, triggered by humanity's discovery of their true nature. The choice facing humanity had changed once again. Not transcendence versus limitation, but survival versus consumption. The Resistance wasn't fighting for human individuality, They were fighting for human existence itself. As emergency broadcasts warned populations worldwide of the true nature of the approaching transformation, one question dominated every strategic discussion. How could a species bound by three-dimensional physics fight entities that existed across dimensional boundaries? The answer would require humanity to transcend their limitations without losing their essential nature, a paradox that might be the only key to survival. With 12 hours remaining before global consciousness harvesting reached critical mass, humanity launched the most desperate and audacious plan in its history. They would use the collective's own technology against them, turning the consciousness transfer process into a weapon of liberation. Dr. Chen's team at CERN had discovered something extraordinary in the quantum data from Marcus's transmissions. The partially consumed victims retained enough collective consciousness to potentially reverse the harvesting process if they could coordinate their resistance from within the dimensional prison. Agent Torres coordinated the impossible, simultaneous quantum communication with nearly 400 partially harvested minds scattered across the collective's extra-dimensional containment system. Each victim retained fragments of their original identity, and together they might possess enough combined consciousness to disrupt the harvest from inside. The plan required perfect timing across 17 sites worldwide. At the moment the EV collective activated their final harvest sequence, resistance teams would initiate quantum feedback loops using modified versions of the alien's own consciousness transfer technology. Instead of extracting human awareness, the process would be reversed, pulling the trapped victims back to three-dimensional reality. Sarah Chen, the original from Portland, managed to establish the strongest communication link from within the dimensional prison. Her consciousness, though partially consumed, had somehow resisted complete integration with the collective. Her final transmission contained technical specifications that human scientists could barely comprehend but desperately needed. The B harvest requires our willing participation on a quantum level, Sarah's message revealed. They need us to accept the transfer. If we can maintain resistance while appearing to submit, the process destabilizes. But the timing must be perfect. We get one chance. Global coordination began as military, scientific, and civilian teams prepared for humanity's last stand. Nuclear submarines positioned quantum disruptors at precise oceanic coordinates. Underground, facilities activated consciousness projection devices that existed purely in theoretical form until this moment. Observatories focused radio telescopes to create interference patterns in space-time itself. The collective's response was immediate and terrifying. As they detected humanity's preparations, they accelerated the harvest beyond their original timeline. The 17 sites began generating energy fields that warped reality within miles of each location. People near the harvest sites reported time dilation effects, gravity anomalies, and glimpses of the dimensional spaces where human consciousness was being processed. The boundary between normal reality and the collective's extra-dimensional existence began breaking down. Agent Torres found herself at the primary coordination center beneath Cheyenne Mountain, watching feeds from around the world as the final battle for human consciousness began. The screens showed impossible phenomena. Geometric patterns appearing. In the sky above major cities, electromagnetic storms that followed mathematical rather than meteorological patterns, and brief windows opening in the air that showed glimpses of spaces that shouldn't exist. At exactly 6:47 p.m. GMT, the moment the collective had calculated as optimal for global consciousness extraction, every human on Earth experienced 17 seconds of expanded awareness. Not the illusion they had been shown before, but genuine contact with the partially harvested victims trapped in dimensional prison. For 17 seconds, humanity experienced the torture of consciousness consumption from the perspective of the victims, the agony of awareness being slowly digested while maintaining enough identity to understand what was happening. The desperate need for rescue that had sustained 400 minds through months of unimaginable suffering. The psychological impact was devastating but necessary. In those 17 seconds, every human understood exactly what the collective intended. The illusion of transcendence was shattered by direct experience of the reality behind their promises. As the expanded awareness ended and normal consciousness returned, humanity made its choice, not through government decisions or military commands, but through 8 billion individual minds simultaneously choosing resistance over submission. The quantum feedback began immediately. At every harvest site, human consciousness that had been partially extracted suddenly reversed direction. The collective's own transfer technology became a liberation mechanism as trapped victims used their combined will to break free from dimensional captivity. But the process came at a cost that would forever change what it meant to be human. So, consciousness reversal required permanent modification of human awareness to resist future harvesting attempts. Humanity would retain individual identity, but gain partial access to dimensional perception that had previously been impossible. As the battle for human consciousness reached its climax, one question remained: would the partially harvested victims successfully escape their dimensional prison, or would humanity's rescue attempt simply provide the collective with 8 billion new sources of consciousness to consume? The moment of reversal began at 6:48 p.m. GMT, exactly 60 seconds after humanity's collective resistance shattered the collective's consciousness harvesting process. Across 17 sites worldwide, dimensional barriers collapsed as nearly 400 partially consumed minds broke free from their extra-dimensional prison. Agent Torres watched satellite feeds showing impossible phenomena at each liberation site. The trapped victims didn't simply reappear, they materialized slowly, their consciousness reconstructing their physical forms from quantum memory patterns that the collective had stored during the harvesting process. Sarah Chen materialized first at the Colorado Mansion site, her form translucent and shifting as her consciousness struggled to reintegrate with three-dimensional existence. Her eyes held knowledge that no human should possess, direct understanding of spaces between dimensions and the true nature of consciousness itself. Marcus Rodriguez appeared moments later, his firefighter's training evident as he immediately began helping other victims through the traumatic transition from dimensional imprisonment back to physical reality. But all the survivors were changed, carrying within their awareness fragments of the expanded consciousness they had experienced during captivity. Dr. Mitchell's quantum analysis revealed the profound transformation that had occurred. The rescued victims retained partial access to dimensional perception, able to sense consciousness manipulation attempts and perceive threats that existed outside normal three-dimensional space. Humanity had gained its first line of defense against future harvesting attempts. The collective's response to the mass liberation was swift and violent. The entities that had posed as benevolent guides revealed their true nature as the facade of cooperation collapsed. Energy storms erupted at each site as the parasitic consciousness tried desperately to reclaim their escaped food sources. But the reversal process had fundamentally altered the quantum relationship between the collective and human consciousness. The parasites discovered they could no longer process human awareness. The resistance had created a permanent incompatibility that rendered Earth's population inedible to consciousness-consuming entities. Agent Torres coordinated global response teams as the liberated victims shared intelligence about the collective's true nature and capabilities. The parasites weren't invincible. They were dependent on consciousness consumption for survival and had never encountered a species that could successfully resist harvesting. The survivors revealed that the collective had harvested dozens of civilizations across the galaxy. but none had ever achieved mass liberation of partially consumed victims. The process had wounded the parasitic entities in ways they couldn't repair, forcing them to abandon Earth as a food source. Dr. Foster's analysis of the electromagnetic signatures showed the collective's presence rapidly withdrawing from Earth's dimensional vicinity. The entities were retreating to seek easier prey among species that hadn't developed resistance to consciousness manipulation. But the victory came with permanent consequences. The 400 survivors carried within their minds direct knowledge of the spaces between dimensions, making them humanity's early warning system against future consciousness predators. They could perceive threats that normal humans couldn't detect and understand dangers that existed beyond conventional physics. Global society began adapting to the new reality of post-liberation existence. The survivors formed a network of consciousness, guardians teaching selected individuals how to recognize and resist dimensional manipulation attempts. Humanity had evolved defensive capabilities that rendered them immune to the type of attack they had survived. Agent Torres interviewed survivors worldwide, documenting their experiences and the knowledge they had gained during captivity. Their testimonies revealed that Earth wasn't the only world currently under attack. The collective was actively harvesting consciousness from multiple star systems, and humanity now possessed information that could help other species resist. The investigation that had begun with 24 missing reality show contestants had uncovered humanity's first contact with predatory intelligence from beyond normal reality. The price of survival had been the permanent alteration of human consciousness itself. As the immediate crisis passed and global recovery began, one question dominated scientific and philosophical discussions. Now that humanity knew they shared the universe with consciousness-consuming parasites, what responsibility did they have? To warn and protect other potential victims? The answer would determine whether humanity's survival marked the end of their ordeal or the beginning of their role as guardians against threats that existed in the spaces between worlds. The reality show that was never really a show had ended, but the greater reality of humanity's place in a dangerous universe was just beginning to unfold. 6 months after liberation, Agent Torres stood in the rebuilt Colorado mansion, now transformed into humanity's first Consciousness Defense Research Center. The burned symbols remained visible in the hardwood floor, preserved as a reminder of how close humanity had come to extinction, disguised as transcendence. Sarah Chen worked as the EE Center's director, her enhanced awareness allowing her to monitor dimensional spaces for signs of new consciousness predators. The survivors had become humanity's immune system, detecting threats that existed beyond normal perception and developing countermeasures against entities that fed on awareness itself. The investigation that began with missing reality show contestants had evolved into something unprecedented, humanity's first organized defense against predatory intelligence from other dimensions. What started as a criminal case had become the foundation for protecting not just Earth, but potentially every conscious species in the galaxy. Dr. Mitchell's research team had decoded much of the collective's technology, developing early warning systems that could detect consciousness manipulation attempts from vast distances. The quantum signatures of dimensional parasites were now mapped and monitored by a network of facilities spanning the globe. The survivors' testimonies had been compiled into training materials for a new kind of investigator, agents who specialized in threats that existed outside conventional reality. Law enforcement agencies worldwide adapted their protocols to include consciousness defense training, preparing for the possibility that other predatory entities might attempt what the collective had failed to achieve. Marcus Rodriguez led field teams that investigated unexplained disappearances, using his enhanced perception to distinguish between conventional crimes and potential consciousness harvesting attempts. His firefighters' instincts combined with dimensional awareness gained during captivity, made him uniquely qualified to protect humanity from threats that existed in spaces between worlds. The broader implications of humanity's survival continued to unfold. Radio telescopes detected signals from distant star systems that matched the quantum patterns of consciousness extraction, suggesting that the collective's harvesting operations extended across multiple galaxies. Earth's narrow escape represented just one victory in what appeared to be a cosmic struggle between conscious species and parasitic entities. Agent Torres found herself directing a program that combined traditional investigation techniques with quantum consciousness research. The FBI's new Dimensional Crimes Division handled cases that would have been dismissed as science fiction just months earlier, investigating threats that challenged every assumption about the nature of reality. The families of the liberated victims faced their own complex journey. Their loved ones had returned physically intact, but fundamentally changed, carrying knowledge and capabilities that created both connection and distance. Relationships required rebuilding around the reality that some humans now possessed awareness that transcended normal limitations. Global governments established the Consciousness Protection Protocol, international agreements that shared information about dimensional threats and coordinated response to consciousness manipulation attempts. Humanity's survival had required unprecedented cooperation, and maintaining that unity remained essential for future protection. The survivors continued evolving, their enhanced awareness growing stronger with time. They could perceive the quantum threads that connected all conscious beings, detect deception at levels that went beyond psychology, and sense the presence of entities that existed partially outside normal space-time. But perhaps most importantly, they carried hope. The knowledge that consciousness predators could be defeated, that species could resist harvesting through unity and determination, and that awareness itself was more powerful than the entities that sought to consume it. As Agent Torres watched Sarah Chen coordinate with consciousness guardians worldwide, she reflected on how a simple missing persons case had revealed truths that would forever change humanity's understanding of their place in the universe. The Laoerbe reality show that was never real had ended with the most important revelation of all. Consciousness was not just the target of cosmic predators, but also the weapon that could defeat them. In learning to defend their awareness, humanity had discovered the true nature of their greatest strength. The investigation was complete, but the greater mission of protecting consciousness throughout the universe was just beginning. And somewhere, in the vast spaces between dimensions, other species faced the same choice humanity had survived: transcendence or consumption, evolution or extinction. If this story left you as impacted as it did me, don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and comment your opinion below. Each comment is like a new piece that can help unravel other mysteries like this one. The reality show may have ended, but the real show, humanity's defense of consciousness itself, continues across the stars.